Welcome to another episode of the Patio Pioneering Podcast. This is another solo episode that will drop while I'm on the backcountry at Philmont Scout Ranch with a crew of scouts. We will be heading to Peniel for the next to last night on the trail. The last solo episode was about something I've been thinking about for quite a while. How adults sometimes ruin youth activities by stepping in when they should be stepping back. As I was preparing that episode, I realized there was another side to that same coin. Sometimes leadership means getting out of the way, but sometimes leadership means stepping forward. I think we've all heard the phrase, somebody ought to do something. Maybe you've said it. I know I have. Somebody ought to fix this. Somebody ought to volunteer. Somebody ought to run. Somebody ought to help. It's an easy sentence to say because somebody doesn't have a face and it's just an idea. Every once in a while, life has a way of asking a much harder question. What happens when you realize that somebody has a name? And what happens when that name is yours? Today I want to talk about that moment. Not just in politics, not just in community service, but in life. Because I think every one of us eventually reaches a point where we have to decide whether we're going to keep hoping someone else steps forward or whether it's finally our turn. Yeah, we've all been that guy. We've all been the one that said somebody ought. It could be when we're sitting at the coffee shop with a bunch of other people with a hot cup of joe in our hands. It could be in bed with your wife or husband saying, hey, I had this happen and somebody ought to fix it. It could be sitting around talking to people about politics. And it could be sitting around talking to yourself. Somebody ought. But even though sometimes we all become somebody ought people, life has a different perspective when you change from the 10x lens and switch over to that fisheye lens that sees a broad perspective. And when we change the perspective, it changes the questions that we ask. Sometimes leadership means getting out of the way, but that's only half of leadership. Because there's a point where experience becomes responsibility. Now, I think back to my short story of my decision to become a candidate for Springfield Township trustee. I had some perspective after some writing. And after sitting back and being that guy for a long time, I finally decided it was time for that person to step up, and that person was me. I think I'm uniquely qualified to serve. My experiences in my life give me a perspective that's a little different than a lot of people. But I think we all need to ask the question of ourselves. And that question is, where are you uniquely qualified to serve? Because each and every one of us has a different experience. We have a different perspective on life. We have a different path that we took. And saying that you're qualified to serve doesn't make you better than anybody. It's because your experiences are different. Now think about the scoutmaster at your son's troop, or the coach, or the youth pastor, or a myriad of other people that you interact with that have stepped forward and said, yeah, it's time my name's been called. What keeps you saying somebody ought instead of saying somebody's me? Now, there's a sense of false humility that a lot of us have. And we'll say, I'm not the right person. I'm not the right person is wisdom. Sometimes it's like, truly, I'm not the right person because of this. But sometimes that false humility or that refusal to step forward is just fear. Sometimes it's out of convenience because life's a lot easier when you don't step forward. Sometimes it's that false humility of, no, I can't do that. But leadership is learning the difference between false humility and a valid reason that you should not lead. But I come back to another point that I think about all the time, is that every single one of us has something to offer. Some offer ideas, some offer wisdom, and others have callous hands that offer leadership through example. And if we think back to that 0.6 zoom, that fisheye lens that gives us a broad perspective, sometimes our priorities look different when we step back and look at the whole picture instead of concentrating on what we think is the important task. Now, in the last episode, we talked about knowing when to step back in that Eagle Scout project, standing back and letting that 17-year-old lead. In that meeting, letting the VP lead instead of stepping in. And today we're talking about you need to know when it's time for you to step forward. But the interesting part is that leadership requires both. Both stepping forward and standing back. That's a contradiction, but it requires both. It requires self-awareness and the humility to know when you need to step back and the courage to step forward. So the next time you find yourself saying somebody ought to, ask yourself one more time, what if today that somebody is me?